Hello ladies and gentlemen, Topak Gaming Man here. In the last few weeks on this channel, I have been focusing on the regional differences between the Super Nintendo in North America and the Super Nintendo in PAL regions, such as Europe. Last week, I made North America envious by going through a list of my top 10 favourite games for the platform that all saw releases throughout the PAL regions but never made it across the pond to the New World. Today, we are going to look at the opposite side of the coin and look at my top 10 favourite Super Nintendo games that got released in North America but nowhere else in the West. Well, when I say top 10, I actually mean top 11, because as I was writing this list, I realised I forgot one of my key favourites and didn't want to drop any games off the list I had wrote about already. Anyway, this list features tons of amazing games many of us missed out on in our childhood, but on the bright side, it has made the Super Nintendo even more special, as these regional releases gave me some top tier games to import and play as an adult. It is an interesting yet horrifying factoid that in terms of turn-based role-playing games on the Super Nintendo, Japan received 58 different releases, North America only received 14 releases, and for us people in PAL regions such as Europe, we got a grand total of 3 turn-based role-playing games for the platform. So yes, the platform that is heralded in the States as being one of the ultimate JRPG consoles never even saw most of those games released in the majority of the Western countries. The reason why I believe these games are missing from PAL regions is that in most cases it would have been very complex, risky and costly to roll these games out at the time, especially in places like Europe. First off, Japanese role-playing games were an unproven, unestablished genre in my part of the world back in the early 90s. On top of that, due to all the different languages we have in Europe, the publishers would have had to create various different translations of the game, which would have been a cost risk in itself, considering these games might not have sold well. So to put the icing on the cake regarding this problem, Super Nintendo cartridges could only hold a finite amount of data on them. It was a big enough challenge at the time to even try and fit all of the English text on a cartridge. Apparently words contain a lot more characters when written in English rather than Japanese, so this meant that massive chunks of story needed to be cut out of games like Secret of Mana in order to even make an English translation possible. In today's world, with larger storage mediums, it is no problem at all to release one disc that lets you play through a massive game in English, Spanish, French, German and Italian. But back then, the only way to release JRPGs in Europe would have been to create the various versions of the same game, each sold in a different language, which as explained earlier would have been a massive cost risk when you consider the amount of money and effort it would have taken to pull all this off. Right, now we have that out of the way, let's finally look at some of the games North America got, but Europe sadly missed out on. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom is a Japanese role-playing game developed by Neverland and published by Taito in 1993. It is the first title in the Lufia series, and strangely enough we received Lufia 2 over in Europe. However, they renamed the game to simply Lufia. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom plays much like a traditional role-playing video game and features 2D character sprites and environments. The player advances the story by travelling through several harsh dungeons, encountering monsters along the way. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom is fondly remembered today for its story and characters, whilst others criticise it as being inferior to other console RPGs of that era, some of which were absolutely spectacular. However, I am sure you will hear all about those later on the list. Kirbys Dreamland 3 is the 5th platforming game in the Kirby series and the sequel to Kirbys Dreamland 2 on the original Game Boy. It is of note that Kirbys Dreamland 3 was the last game published for the Super Nintendo in North America. Apparently, problems with the game's PAL conversion prevented it from being released in both Europe and Australia at the time. The game's platforming mechanics are very similar to most other Kirby games, as is Kirby's skill set. Kirby is able to jump, duck, slide, fly by inflating himself, as well as perform his signature move inhaling enemies. Like in previous games, when Kirby inhales and digests an enemy, he can mimic their abilities. Within this game, Kirby can also team up with 6 animal friends, 3 of which were introduced in previous games in the series. This friend mechanic allows Kirby to be ridden, carried or rolled, enabling new team-based abilities, as well as variations of Kirby's copy abilities. To quote Nintendo Life, this game presents a lovable gaming experience and is a worthy sequel. Next on the list, we have an RPG developed by Capcom in 1993, Breath of Fire. This was the first game in a long series, and if I recall, the sequel, Breath of Fire 2, actually did receive a European release. The series is notable for its recurring characters and ambiguous continuity, though each game is its own self-contained story. The names of the 2 lead characters are usually Nina and Ryu, not to be confused with Ryu in Street Fighter, or Ryu, however you're supposed to pronounce that bloody stupid name. It is of note that the original box art for this game was drawn in an anime art style. However, as expected, the artwork was quickly ripped up and bastardized by the American marketeers when they replaced the art style with images of oily, muscly men. For some reason, American companies seem to have a hard-on for that sort of imagery, as they seem to love promoting steroid abuse to the youth of their country for some odd reason. Personally, I'd rather not die at 50. Why did they want the children of the 90s to grow up to be a bunch of vain, uneducated Neanderthals? Anyway, back on point, Breath of Fire is a traditional role-playing video game featuring 2-dimensional character sprites and environments presented from a top-down perspective. Players move their characters in 4 directions while navigating through a number of environments ranging from towns to dungeons filled with traps and monsters. Overall, this is a great game within its genre, which features beautiful artwork, a great story, very good fight scenes and some amazing music. Final Fantasy IV was released as Final Fantasy II in North America due to the fact that 2 of the games in the series remained as Japan exclusives up until that point. Over in Europe and PAL regions on the other hand, we were still yet to receive our first dose of Final Fantasy action. This 1991 release published by Square features a story which follows Cecil, a Dark Knight, as he tries to prevent the sorcerer Golbez from seizing powerful crystals and destroying the world. He is joined on this quest by a frequently changing group of allies. I don't think I really need to go into much detail with this one, as so much ground has been covered on this title already. If you are interested when us Europeans got to play the game though, I believe my first playthrough was on the re-release of the game on the PS1 in 2002, so I only had to wait 11 years longer than the Americans, which isn't that bad at all. I guess on the bright side they are still waiting on Terranigma on the other hand. In regards to the game itself though, the character-driven plot, music and use of new technologies made Final Fantasy IV a landmark title within the genre of JRPGs, and back in 1991 this was the benchmark for games of this style. We received the original Super Nintendo version of Final Fight in PAL regions, however we didn't receive the enhanced re-release known as Final Fight Guy. The original port of this arcade hit didn't include one of the main characters, known as Guy. In this version you have the opportunity to play as either Guy or Mike Haggar, who I must point out has an absolutely ravishing moustache. What a well-groomed individual. For those unfamiliar with the franchise, which won't be many of you to be honest, this game is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you fight through 5 levels, kicking, punching and even using the occasional weapon. Essentially think of a watered down Tesco value version of Streets of Rage for the Mega Drive and you get Final Fight. It is also of note that Capcom made a number of changes from the Japanese version when releasing this game stateside. Most notably, the complete removal of the trans character Poison and Roxy, a female redhead from the game. At first glance I'd give Capcom the benefit of the doubt and say this was done in an effort to avoid promoting violence against women, but then again that theory doesn't hold any ground, as there's characters like Chun-Li and Cammy within the Street Fighter franchise. So this leads me to one horrible conclusion, that America, land of the free, clearly had no room for trans people at the time, as the trans character was removed from the game in the same way blood effects and alcohol references were taken out of the game. I thought America was all about freedom and being progressive, so why on earth was the localization of this game so offensively bigoted? Let me know your thoughts on this in the comment section. So, considering the American version of Final Fight had the trans character removed from the game, I am surprised Evo Search for Eden received a release over there at all. The whole concept of this game is based around the scientific theory of evolution, a well-formed hypothesis that seems to majorly trigger a lot of the creationist lunatics who appear to reside on the continent. Speaking of lunatics, I must say I am extremely happy that the British Empire decided to kick out all of the Puritans from our country back in the 1600s. We decided to dump our unwashed masses over in America over that period. So that may explain some of the odd behaviour I speak of. Anyway, moving away from creationism and Puritans and back to evolution, Evo Search for Eden is a 1992 side-scroller with role-playing elements released by Enix. The game involves the player navigating a creature through a number of side-scrolling levels whilst undergoing bodily evolutions to cope with ever-changing environments. The game received mild but generally positive reviews at the time, and I feel this game deserves a place on this list for its originality at the very least. Earthbound, a great little JRPG that departs from the overused generic conventions from the genre, such as medieval castles, swords and androgynous delinquents trying to destroy the world. Earthbound, on the other hand, is set in a sleepy American town and features weapons such as baseball bats and frying pans. This 1994 game is extremely refreshing to play and features fun innovations throughout the playthrough. The art style and story is interesting too, even if Nintendo did lift it all straight from the French children's movie The Magic Roundabout, Dougal and the Blue Cat, the naughty scallywags. As good as this game is, one thing really does annoy me about this one, and that is how exaggerated the rarity of this cartridge seems to be. There were bloody 140,000 copies sold of this game in North America, effectively making this game common as muck in comparison to many other releases. For some reason, an illusion has evolved over time, and now people will not part with copies unless they get hundreds upon hundreds of dollars for this game. I personally saw how common this game was firsthand, as last year I visited hundreds of retro game stores across North America, and practically every single one of them had copies of Earthbound for sale. I am sorry, but a game isn't rare if you can simply pop to your local store and buy it. Try doing that with Red Sea Crossing on the Atari, for example. That would never happen. So next time you see an Earthbound for sale for hundreds of dollars, think of all the thousands of other copies available elsewhere, which scumbag resellers are struggling to part with due to their ludicrous pricing of the game. Earthbound, more like Earth Scam. If you have been watching my channel for a while, you would realise that it doesn't seem to be possible to make a list video without including bloody space shooters. In 1991, Gradius 3 featured as one of the launch titles for that ugly North American Super Nintendo. The game is a port of the 1989 arcade game which shares the same name. The game features a total of 10 levels in the game, and it is extremely fun to play. Like most space shooters though, the game is extremely difficult for those who actually like to try and complete the games they are playing. Shoot 'em up so bloody hard. Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. I was 9 years old. I loved Mario so much. I had all the posters and the merchandise, and actually got teased at the time by reading about this game in Nintendo Magazine System. It is one of the first times in my life I became aware of region exclusives, along with most of the Ganbei Goemon series being locked to Japan. At the time I had never played an RPG, and didn't really even understand what one even was. However, seeing Mario in this isometric environment sent my childhood imagination into absolute bloody overdrive, and I was desperate to play this game. Years later, after playing tons of RPGs and learning about the magic of emulation, I finally got my childhood wish and got to play this game, and I have to say I loved every second of it. This collaboration between Square and Nintendo functions in much of the same way as the Final Fantasy games. However, platforming mechanics and some reaction-based attacks are included to give this game just that little extra dose of Nintendo magic. Overall, this game was every bit as good as I had always imagined it to be. It was just as interesting to play it as an adult as it was to look at the pictures of the game as a child. This is one to be experienced by both JRPG and Mario fans alike. Next up, we have Final Fantasy VI, which was the third Final Fantasy game in North America. In Europe, we were still yet to ever receive a proper Final Fantasy game, and we wouldn't get our first game until the confusing debut of Final Fantasy VII, which simply left us all baffled and confused as to what happened to the previous 6 entries in the series. Final Fantasy VII, 8 and 9 though all sold fantastically in Europe, which later led to all of the earlier games getting ported to the PlayStation in the region. I at least had the pleasure of playing this 1994 game by the time 2002 came around. The game is set in a fantasy world with a technology level equivalent to that of the Second Industrial Revolution. The game's story focuses on a group of rebels as they seek to overthrow an imperial dictatorship. The game features 14 permanent playable characters, the most of any game in the main series. This game is not just one of the best role-playing games on the Super Nintendo, this game is probably one of the best JRPGs of all time, full stop. Everything in this game is absolutely spot on. From the gameplay to the story and music, everything is well developed and thought out. Personally, I love and respect the hell out of this game, despite not even getting to play it until well after its graphical prime. Final Fantasy VI is pretty much offers everything Final Fantasy VII could, even with its 2D handicap. This is a must-play game, both then and now. As usual, I always try and save the absolute best until last, and personally Chrono Trigger could be awarded with all sorts of crowns. Best JRPG of all time, best game on the Super Nintendo, best art style on the system. This game is the dog's bollocks, the cream of the crop, and such a fun and memorable experience to partake in. The game was the ultimate collaboration between the makers of the Dragon Quest series of games, the Final Fantasy series, and the bloody people who made Dragon Ball Z. What an outrageous team we had there! The story of the game features an interesting time travel mechanic and takes place in a world familiar to Earth, with eras such as the prehistoric age, in which primitive humans and dinosaurs share the Earth, the Middle Ages, replete with knights, monsters and magic, and the post-apocalyptic future, where destitute humans and sentient robots struggle to survive. The characters frequently travel through time to obtain allies, gather equipment and learn information to help them in their quest. The party also gains access to the End of Time, which serves as a hub to travel back to other time periods. This game is disgustingly brilliant, and even saved me from having a terrible vacation once. Europe finally saw an official release of this game for the Nintendo DS in the late 2000s, and thankfully for me, this game was the perfect travel companion, which helped me cope with holidaying in Tunisia, which turned out to be one of the most horrible, depressing places I have been on Earth. And I have even been to America, ladies and gentlemen. Fancy that. So thank you, Chrono Trigger, for saving my holiday. I couldn't have coped in Africa without you. So that was my list of 11 great Super Nintendo games that North America got, but PAL regions at the time were deprived of. Do you think my list was right? Or do you think I should have perhaps included some other titles instead? Let me know in the comments section. Thank you for watching today's video. If you are new here, don't forget to like and subscribe. It is always jolly good fun to discuss global gaming history. It is good to learn and celebrate difference. Shout out to Shizuka Kobayashi, Retail Archaeology, Andrew Bazanski, Peter Dawn, Mike Frost, Edward O'Reilly, Hatunas Garcia and all of my other patrons. Thank you for all of your support. Yeah! If you want to be added to this prestigious list of very helpful people, then check out my Patreon page. Ta-ta and farewell.